What would you do if someone disrespected you in the worst way possible? What if that disrespect was not just an insult, but an act of pure hatred? And what if, in the blink of an eye, karma stepped in to balance the scales? This is a story about racism, revenge, and the unexpected twists of fate that remind us all, what goes around comes around. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories like this one. Now let's get into it. The coffee was scalding hot. The kind of hot that makes your skin scream the moment it touches you. Marcus Johnson sat frozen in his seat, his face burning, his chest heaving with a mix of shock and rage. The entire diner had gone silent. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of coffee falling from his chin onto the table. His white shirt was ruined, stained brown, and his skin felt like it was on fire. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a tight ponytail and a smirk plastered across her face, stood over him, the empty coffee pot still in her hand. "Oops," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I guess you shouldn't have come in here." Marcus clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she had just inflicted on him. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because he knew what would happen if he did. He'd seen it before, on the news and stories in real life. A black man losing his temper in public never ended well. So he sat there, silent, as the waitress turned on her heel and walked away, her laughter echoing in his ears. But karma was already stirring. Unseen, unnoticed, but undeniably present. And it was about to strike in the most unexpected way. Let's rewind. Let's go back to the beginning, to the moment Marcus walked into that diner, completely unaware of how his day was about to spiral out of control. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in the small town of Cedar Ridge, a place where everyone knew everyone, and where outsiders stuck out like sore thumbs. Marcus was just passing through, on his way to a job interview in the next city over. He'd been driving for hours, and his stomach was growling. When he saw the diner on the side of the road, its neon sign flickering weakly in the daylight, he decided to stop for a quick bite. The moment he walked in, he felt the eyes on him. The diner was mostly empty, save for a few elderly couples and a truck driver sitting at the counter. But every single person turned to look at him as the bell above the door jingled. Marcus ignored them, just like he always did. He was used to it by now. He found a booth near the window and slid into the seat, pulling out his phone to check the time. The waitress, whose name tag read Linda, approached him with a forced smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Yeah, can I get a coffee and the breakfast special?" Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice friendly. Linda didn't write anything down. She just stared at him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, before turning and walking away. Marcus sighed. He knew that look. He'd seen it 1,000 times before. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here." But he wasn't going to let it ruin his day. He had an interview to get to, a job he really needed. So he sat there, scrolling through his phone, trying to ignore the whispers from the other tables. A few minutes later, Linda returned with his coffee. She set it down in front of him a little too hard, and some of the liquid sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the table. "Careful," Marcus said, reaching for a napkin. Linda didn't apologize. She just stood there, watching him with that same tight-lipped smile. "Anything else?" she asked, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "No, that's it for now," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice calm. Linda walked away, and Marcus took a sip of his coffee. It was bitter, but he didn't care. He just needed something to wake him up. He was halfway through his cup when Linda returned with his food. She set the plate down in front of him, but before he could even say thank you, she leaned in close, her voice low. "You know," she said, her breath hot against his ear, "we don't serve your kind here." Marcus froze. His heart started to race, and his stomach churned. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, Linda straightened up and walked away, her ponytail swinging behind her. He stared down at his plate, his appetite gone. He wanted to leave, to get out of there as fast as he could. But he couldn't. Not yet. He had to finish his coffee, at least. He couldn't let her win. So he sat there, forcing himself to eat, even though every bite tasted like ash. And then, just as he was about to leave, it happened. Linda came back with a coffee pot. She stood over him, her eyes cold, her lips curled into a sneer. And then, without a word, she tilted the pot, and the scalding liquid came pouring out, right onto his face. The pain was instant, blinding. Marcus gasped, his hands flying up to his face as the coffee burned his skin. He could hear Linda laughing, the sound cutting through the haze of pain and shock. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it was over. Linda was gone, and Marcus was left sitting there, his face burning, his heart pounding in his chest. But karma was already on its way, and when it arrived, it was going to hit Linda harder than she ever could have imagined. Marcus sat in the diner booth, his face still burning from the scalding coffee. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation coursing through him. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, some wide with shock, others quickly looking away as if they hadn't seen a thing. The diner was eerily quiet now, the usual clatter of plates and murmur of conversation replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Linda, the waitress, had disappeared into the kitchen, her laughter still ringing in Marcus's ears. He wanted to get up and leave, to walk out and never look back. But something inside him refused to let her win. He wasn't going to let her chase him out like some unwanted stray. So he stayed put, wiping his face with a napkin, his hands trembling with anger. The truck driver at the counter, a burly man with a scruffy beard, turned in his seat and glanced at Marcus. For a moment, their eyes met, and Marcus thought he saw a flicker of sympathy in the man's gaze. But then the truck driver looked away, focusing on his coffee as if nothing had happened. Marcus sighed. He wasn't surprised. In a town like Cedar Ridge, people tended to mind their own business, especially when it came to things they didn't want to deal with. Marcus reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling as he unlocked the screen. He needed to call someone to tell someone what had just happened. But who? His mind raced as he scrolled through his contacts. His mom? She'd just worry. His best friend, Jamal? He'd tell Marcus to leave before things got worse. Marcus hesitated, his thumb hovering over the call button. Before he could make a decision, the bell above the diner door jingled, and a new customer walked in. It was a woman, maybe in her late 30s, with sharp features and a no-nonsense expression. She was dressed in a crisp business suit, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor as she made her way to the counter. Marcus didn't pay much attention to her at first. He was too focused on his own problems. But then he heard her voice, clear and commanding, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Linda, who had just emerged from the kitchen. "I'd like to speak to the manager." Linda froze, her smirk faltering for the first time. "I'm the manager," she said, her voice tight. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Is that so? Well then, I'd like to speak to you about the unacceptable behavior I just witnessed." Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected anyone to stand up for him, least of all a stranger. He watched as the woman crossed her arms, her gaze locked on Linda like a hawk sizing up its prey. "I don't know what you're talking about," Linda said, her voice wavering slightly. "Don't play dumb," the woman shot back. "I saw what you did to that man over there, and I'm pretty sure everyone else in this diner did too." The other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Linda's face turned red, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "Listen, lady," she said, her voice rising. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is my diner, and I'll run it however I see fit." The woman didn't flinch. "Oh, I know exactly who I am," she said, her tone icy. "And I also know that what you just did is assault. So you have two choices. You can apologize to that man right now, or I can call the police and let them handle it." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't even considered calling the police. In his experience, they rarely took the side of a black man in situations like this. But the woman's confidence gave him a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Linda, however, wasn't backing down. "You can call whoever you want," she sneered. "But I'm not apologizing to him. He shouldn't have come in here in the first place." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Marcus thought she was going to slap Linda. But instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "Fine," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Let's see how the police feel about this." Linda's face went pale, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. She glanced around the diner, as if hoping someone would come to her defense. But no one did. The other customers were too busy pretending to be invisible. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to leave, to get out of there before things escalated. But another part of him wanted to stay, to see this through. He had been silent for too long, letting people like Linda treat him like he was less than human. Maybe it was time to fight back. Before he could make a decision, the woman turned to him, her expression softening. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. His face still stung, and his pride was bruised, but he was alive. And for now, that was enough. "Good," the woman said, "because you don't deserve to be treated like this." "No one does," Linda scoffed, but the woman ignored her, her attention focused entirely on Marcus. "My name's Sarah," she said, extending her hand, "and I'm not going to let her get away with this." Marcus hesitated for a moment before shaking her hand. "Marcus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah gave him a small smile before turning back to Linda, her expression hardening once again. "Last chance," she said. "Apologize or I make the call." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say a word, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Everyone in the diner turned toward the windows, their eyes wide with surprise. A police car pulled into the parking lot, its lights flashing. Marcus's heart sank. He hadn't even had a chance to decide what he wanted to do, and now the police were here. He braced himself for the worst, his mind racing with all the possible outcomes. But as the officers stepped out of the car and made their way toward the diner, he couldn't help but notice the look of panic on Linda's face. Karma, it seemed, had arrived right on time. The bell above the diner door jingled again, but this time it wasn't a customer. Two police officers stepped inside, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the room. The older officer, a tall man with a stern expression, scanned the diner with sharp eyes. His younger partner, a woman with her hand resting on her belt, looked around with a mix of curiosity and caution. Marcus's stomach churned. He had been in situations like this before, situations where the police were called, and somehow he always ended up being the one who looked guilty. He clenched his fists under the table, trying to steady his breathing. He couldn't afford to panic, not now. Sarah, the woman who had stood up for him, didn't seem fazed. She turned to the officers, her posture confident, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I'm the one who called." The older officer nodded, his eyes flicking toward Marcus before settling on Linda, who was still standing behind the counter, her face pale. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked. Sarah didn't hesitate. "This woman," she said, pointing at Linda, "assaulted that man over there." She gestured toward Marcus. She poured scalding hot coffee on his face, unprovoked, and then laughed about it. "I witnessed the entire thing, and so did everyone else in this diner." The officer's eyebrows shot up, and he turned to Linda. "Is that true?" Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For the first time since Marcus had walked into the diner, she looked genuinely scared. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Didn't mean to?" Sarah interrupted, her tone sharp. "You poured coffee on his face and told him he shouldn't have come in here. That doesn't sound like an accident to me." The younger officer stepped forward, her hand still on her belt. "Ma'am, is there any reason you would do something like that?" she asked, her voice neutral, but her eyes narrowing slightly. Linda's face turned red, and she glanced around the diner, as if hoping someone would come to her defense. But the other customers were silent, their eyes fixed on their plates or the walls, avoiding the scene unfolding in front of them. Even the truck driver, who had seemed sympathetic earlier, didn't say a word. Marcus finally found his voice. "She told me they don't serve my kind here," he said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "And then she poured the coffee on me." The older officer's expression darkened, and he turned back to Linda. "Is that true?" he asked again, his voice harder this time. Linda opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her hands were shaking, and she looked like she was about to cry. The younger officer stepped closer to her, her hand now resting on her handcuffs. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," she said. Linda's eyes widened in panic. "Wait, no, you don't understand," she cried, her voice rising. He was being rude. He was—" "Enough," the older officer said, cutting her off. "You can explain yourself at the station. Right now, we're taking you in for assault." Marcus watched in stunned silence as the younger officer handcuffed Linda and led her out of the diner. The older officer stayed behind, turning to Marcus with a sympathetic expression. "Are you okay, sir?" he asked. "Do you need medical attention?" Marcus shook his head, though his face still stung. "I'm fine," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. His mind was still reeling from everything that had just happened. The officer nodded. "We'll need you to come down to the station to give a statement," he said. "But for now, take your time. We'll make sure she's held accountable for what she did." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. He had never expected things to turn out like this. He had expected to be ignored, dismissed, or worse. But instead, Linda was the one being led away in handcuffs, and he was the one being treated with respect. Sarah walked over to him, her expression softening. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Marcus nodded again, though he still felt numb. "Yeah," he said. "Thanks to you." Sarah smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "You shouldn't have to thank me," she said. "What she did was wrong, and someone needed to stand up to her. I'm just glad I was here to do it." Marcus didn't know what to say to that. He had spent so much of his life dealing with people like Linda, people who treated him like he was less than human. He had learned to keep his head down, to stay quiet, to avoid confrontation. But today, for the first time, someone had stood up for him, and it had made all the difference. The older officer cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "We'll be in touch," he said. "In the meantime, take care of yourself." Marcus nodded, and the officer left, leaving him and Sarah alone in the diner. The other customers had started to trickle out, their faces a mix of guilt and relief. The truck driver lingered for a moment, glancing at Marcus as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he just nodded and walked out. Sarah sat down across from Marcus, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, "this isn't over. What happened here today, it's just the beginning." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" Sarah leaned forward, her eyes intense. "People like Linda don't change overnight," she said. "In towns like this, they don't either. But what happened here today? It's a start. It's proof that things can change, that people can be held accountable. But it's up to you to decide what happens next." Marcus didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. He had spent so much of his life trying to avoid trouble, trying to stay out of the spotlight. But now, for the first time, he felt like he had a choice. He could walk away, pretend this never happened, and go back to his life. Or he could stay, fight, and make sure that Linda, and people like her, faced the consequences of their actions. But before he could make a decision, the sound of a car horn outside made him jump. He turned toward the window, his heart racing. A black SUV had pulled into the parking lot, its windows tinted, its engine idling. Marcus didn't know why, but something about it made his skin crawl. Sarah followed his gaze, her expression hardening. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice low. Marcus shook his head. "I don't know," he said, "but I don't think they're here for coffee." The black SUV sat in the parking lot, its engine rumbling softly. Marcus couldn't see who was inside. The tinted windows hid the occupants from view, but he felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. Something about the vehicle felt off, like it didn't belong in this small-town diner parking lot. Sarah noticed his tension and leaned closer, her voice low. "You know them?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. "No, but I don't like the look of it." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she studied the SUV. "Stay here," she said, standing up. "I'll check it out." Before Marcus could protest, she was already walking toward the door, her heels clicking against the floor. He wanted to stop her, to tell her to be careful, but his voice caught in his throat. Instead, he watched as she pushed open the diner door and stepped outside, her posture confident but cautious. The moment Sarah stepped into the parking lot, the SUV's engine revved, and the vehicle began to move. It didn't speed away. Instead, it rolled slowly toward her, like a predator stalking its prey. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Marcus could see her lips moving, but he couldn't hear what she was saying. Inside the diner, Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he couldn't just sit there and do nothing. He stood up, his legs shaky, and made his way to the door. By the time he stepped outside, the SUV had come to a stop just a few feet away from Sarah. The driver's side window rolled down, and a man's face appeared. He was middle-aged, with a shaved head and a thick beard. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. "You the one who called the cops on Linda?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Sarah didn't flinch. "And if I am," she shot back. The man's lips curled into a smirk. "You might want to mind your own business," he said. "This town doesn't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble." Sarah took a step closer, her eyes locked on his. "And I don't take kindly to racists assaulting innocent people," she said, her voice sharp. "So, why don't you tell me who you are and what you want?" The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You've got guts, lady," he said. "But guts won't save you if you keep poking your nose where it doesn't belong." Marcus's heart was pounding now. He didn't know who this man was, but he could tell he was dangerous. He stepped forward, standing beside Sarah, though his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice trembling but firm. The man's eyes flicked toward Marcus, and his smirk widened. Well, he said, "look who decided to join the party. You must be the one who caused all this trouble." Marcus clenched his fists, his anger flaring. "I didn't cause anything," he said. "She's the one who—" Before he could finish, the man cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Save it," he said. "I don't care about your sob story. What I care about is making sure people like you know your place." Sarah stepped forward, her voice rising. "And what exactly is his place?" she demanded. "Because as far as I'm concerned, he has every right to be here, just like anyone else." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You're playing with fire, lady," he said. "And if you're not careful, you're going to get burned." With that, he rolled up the window, and the SUV's engine roared to life. The vehicle backed up quickly, its tires screeching against the pavement, before speeding out of the parking lot and disappearing down the road. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hands were shaking, and his face still stung from the coffee, but he felt a strange sense of relief. Whatever that was, it was over for now. Sarah turned to him, her expression serious. "You okay?" she asked. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "Yeah," he said. "But who was that guy?" Sarah sighed, her eyes still on the road where the SUV had disappeared. "I don't know," she said. "But I have a feeling he's not going to let this go." Marcus's stomach churned. He had hoped that with Linda being arrested, this nightmare would be over. But now it seemed like it was only just beginning. Back inside the diner, the atmosphere was tense. The few remaining customers were whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward Marcus and Sarah as they returned to their booth. The waitstaff, now without Linda, moved quietly, their faces pale and nervous. Marcus sat down, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. He had a job interview to get to, but the thought of leaving this diner, of stepping back out into the open, made his skin crawl. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a target waiting to be hit. Sarah seemed to sense his unease. "You can't let them scare you," she said, her voice firm. "That's what they want. They want you to feel small, to feel like you don't belong. But you do, and you have every right to be here." Marcus nodded, though her words did little to ease his anxiety. I don't know what to do," he admitted. "I've never been in a situation like this before." Sarah reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "You're not alone," she said. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together." Marcus looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He didn't know why she was helping him, why she cared so much, but he was grateful, more grateful than he could put into words. Before he could respond, the sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. Sarah pulled her phone out of her purse, her expression tightening as she looked at the screen. "I have to take this," she said, standing up. "I'll be right back." Marcus watched as she walked away, her phone pressed to her ear. He couldn't hear what she was saying, but her tone was urgent, her expression serious. He felt a pang of worry. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. A few minutes later, Sarah returned, her face pale. "We need to go," she said, her voice low. Marcus frowned. What's wrong? Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door. I just got a call from a friend at the police station, she said. Linda's been released. And she's not happy. Marcus's heart sank. He had hoped that Linda would be held accountable, that she would face consequences for what she had done. But now it seemed like she was free to do whatever she wanted. What do we do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's expression hardened. We leave, she said. Now. Marcus didn't argue. He stood up, his legs shaky, and followed Sarah out of the diner. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The air felt heavy, charged with tension. As they reached Sarah's car, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the empty parking lot. There was no one there, at least no one he could see. But as Sarah started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, Marcus couldn't help but feel like they were driving straight into the storm. The car ride was tense, the silence between Marcus and Sarah heavy with unspoken worries. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds as if expecting someone to appear behind them. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, his own anxiety bubbling just beneath the surface. He kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the black SUV following them. Where are we going? Marcus finally asked, breaking the silence. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. Somewhere safe, she said. A friend's place. It's outside of town, so we should be able to lay low for a while. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely reassured. He didn't know Sarah well, and while he was grateful for her help, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was putting her in danger. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I can figure something out on my own. Sarah shot him a quick glance, her expression softening. You're not alone in this, Marcus, she said. What happened back there, it's not just your fight. It's mine too, and I'm not going to let them intimidate us. Marcus didn't respond. He wanted to believe her, to trust that everything would be okay. But the memory of Linda's sneering face and the cold eyes of the man in the SUV kept replaying in his mind. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, one that was only getting worse. After about 20 minutes of driving, Sarah turned onto a narrow dirt road that wound through a dense patch of woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches casting long shadows in the fading light. Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as they drove deeper into the forest. It felt like they were leaving the world behind, entering a place where no one could find them or help them. Finally, they reached a small cabin tucked away in the woods. It was modest, with a wooden porch and a chimney puffing out thin wisps of smoke. Sarah parked the car and turned to Marcus. This is it, she said. We'll be safe here. Marcus followed her to the cabin, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even though there was no one in sight. As they stepped inside, he was greeted by the warm glow of a fireplace and the smell of something cooking on the stove. A man emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a kind face and a welcoming smile. Sarah, he said, his voice warm. I was wondering when you'd show up. Sarah smiled back, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Thanks for letting us crash here, Tom, she said. This is Marcus. He's had a rough day. Tom's smile faded as he looked at Marcus, his expression turning serious. I heard, he said. Sarah filled me in on the way over. You're safe here, son. No one's going to bother you. Marcus nodded, though he still felt uneasy. Thank you, he said quietly. Tom clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. Why don't you two sit down? Dinner's almost ready. Marcus and Sarah sat at the small wooden table in the kitchen, the warmth of the fireplace doing little to ease the tension in the room. Tom busied himself in the kitchen, humming softly as he stirred a pot on the stove. The smell of stew filled the air, but Marcus's appetite was non-existent. Sarah leaned closer to Marcus, her voice low. Tom's a good guy, she said. He's helped me out of some tough spots before. We can trust him. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure if he could trust anyone right now. He felt like he was in over his head, like he had stumbled into a world he didn't understand. What happens now? He asked. Sarah sighed, her expression thoughtful. We wait, she said. Linda's not going to let this go, and neither will her friends. But we got the upper hand. We've got evidence, witnesses, and the law on our side. We just need to stay smart and stay safe. Marcus didn't respond. He wanted to believe her, but the fear gnawing at him was hard to ignore. He felt like a sitting duck, waiting for the next blow to fall. As they ate dinner, Tom tried to lighten the mood, telling stories about his time living in the woods and the various animals he'd encountered. Marcus listened, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about the man in the SUV, about the cold look in his eyes and the threat in his voice. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. After dinner, Sarah and Tom cleared the table while Marcus sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. His mind was racing, replaying the events of the day over and over again. Sarah joined him by the fire, sitting down in the chair next to his. "You should try to get some rest," she said gently. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Marcus shook his head. "I can't," he said. "I keep thinking about what happened." "About what could happen?" Sarah nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I get it," she said. "But you're not alone in this, Marcus. We're going to get through it together." Marcus looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. "You don't even know me." Sarah smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said. "And because I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel like the whole world is against you. But you don't have to face it alone." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to thank her, to tell her how much her support meant to him. But the words wouldn't come. Before he could respond, the sound of a car engine broke the silence. Marcus's heart skipped a beat, and he shot to his feet, his eyes darting toward the window. Sarah was already moving, her expression tense. Tom appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "We've got company," he said, his voice low. Marcus's stomach dropped. He didn't need to ask who it was. He could feel it in the air, the same sense of dread that had followed him all day. Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "Stay here," she said. "Tom and I will handle this." Marcus shook his head. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not hiding anymore." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Okay," she said. "But stay behind me." The three of them stepped outside, the cold night air biting at Marcus's skin. The headlights of a car shone through the trees, illuminating the cabin in a harsh, white light. As the car came to a stop, Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. The door opened and a figure stepped out. It wasn't the man from the SUV. It wasn't Linda. It was someone Marcus hadn't expected to see. His breath caught in his throat as he realized who it was. The figure stepped into the light, and Marcus's heart nearly stopped. It was Jamal, his best friend since childhood. Jamal's face was etched with worry, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a look of urgency. He hurried toward Marcus, his eyes scanning the group as if making sure they were all okay. "Marcus!" Jamal called out, his voice filled with relief. "Man, I've been looking everywhere for you. Are you all right?" Marcus stared at him, his mind struggling to process what was happening. "Jamal? What are you doing here? How did you find me?" Jamal reached them, slightly out of breath. "I called your mom when I couldn't reach you. She said you were heading to Cedar Ridge for that job interview. When I heard about what happened at the diner, I knew I had to find you. I've been driving around for hours trying to track you down." Marcus felt a mix of emotions, relief at seeing a familiar face, but also confusion. "How did you know about the diner?" he asked. Jamal hesitated, glancing at Sarah and Tom before answering. "It's all over the news, man. Someone filmed the whole thing on their phone and posted it online. It's gone viral. People are furious." Marcus's stomach churned. He hadn't even considered that someone might have recorded the incident. The thought of millions of strangers watching the most humiliating moment of his life made him feel sick. Sarah stepped forward, her expression serious. "We need to get inside," she said. "It's not safe out here." Jamal nodded, his usual bravado replaced by a rare seriousness. "She's right. Linda's got friends, and they're not happy. I overheard some guys at a gas station talking about how they were going to teach you a lesson. We need to lay low." The group hurried back into the cabin, the warmth of the fireplace doing little to ease the tension in the room. Tom locked the door behind them and pulled the curtains shut, his movements quick and efficient. "We'll be safe here for now," he said. "But we need to figure out our next move." Marcus sat down heavily in a chair, his mind racing. He felt like the walls were closing in on him, like there was no escape from the chaos his life had become. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did this get so out of control?" Sarah sat down across from him, her expression sympathetic. "Because people like Linda thrive on hate," she said, "and when they're exposed, they'll do anything to protect themselves. But we're not going to let them win." Jamal leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "What's the plan then? We can't just sit here and wait for them to come after us." Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowing as she thought. "We need to take control of the narrative," she said. "Marcus, you have a story to tell, and people need to hear it. If we can get the truth out there, it'll be harder for them to silence you." Marcus shook his head, his stomach twisting at the thought. "I don't know if I can do that," he said. I'm not good at talking to people." Sarah reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "I'll be right there with you. And Jamal, too. We'll make sure your voice is heard." Jamal pushed off the wall, his expression determined. "She's right, man. You've got nothing to be ashamed of. Linda's the one who should be ashamed. Let's make sure everyone knows what she did." Marcus looked at his friend, then at Sarah, and finally at Tom, who gave him a reassuring nod. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Okay," he said. "What do we do?" Sarah smiled, though there was a hardness in her eyes. "First, we reach out to the media. There are reporters who will want to hear your story. We'll set up an interview, make sure the truth gets out. Second, we contact the police and make sure they're taking this seriously. And third, we stay vigilant. Linda and her friends aren't going to back down without a fight." Marcus nodded, though he still felt uneasy. He didn't know if he had the strength to face the world, to relive what had happened over and over again. But he knew he didn't have a choice. He couldn't run forever. The next morning, the cabin was a flurry of activity. Sarah spent hours on the phone, coordinating with reporters and lawyers. Jamal stayed by Marcus's side, offering quiet support and cracking jokes to lighten the mood. Tom kept watch outside, his rifle resting across his lap as he scanned the tree line for any signs of trouble. By midday, Sarah had arranged for a local news crew to come to the cabin for an interview. Marcus felt a surge of anxiety as the crew set up their equipment, the bright lights and cameras making him feel exposed. But Sarah was there, her presence steady and reassuring. "Just tell the truth," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's all you need to do." The interview began, and Marcus found himself recounting the events of the previous day. His voice shook at first, but as he spoke, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, he wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He was standing up for himself, and it felt empowering. When the interview was over, the reporter thanked him, her expression sympathetic. "This is going to make a difference," she said. "People need to hear stories like yours." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed her. He just hoped it would be enough to keep Linda and her friends at bay. As the crew packed up their equipment, Sarah pulled Marcus aside. "You did great," she said, her voice filled with pride. "This is just the beginning. We're going to make sure Linda faces justice." Marcus smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you." Sarah squeezed his shoulder, her expression softening. "You're stronger than you think, Marcus. Don't ever forget that." That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Marcus sat on the porch, staring out at the forest. Jamal joined him, handing him a cup of hot cocoa. "You okay, man?" he asked. Marcus took the cup, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know," he admitted. I keep thinking about what happens next. What if it's not enough? What if they come after us?" Jamal sat down beside him, his expression serious. "Then we'll handle it," he said. "You're not alone in this, Marcus. You've got me, Sarah, Tom. We've got your back. No matter what." Marcus nodded, though he still felt a knot of fear in his chest. He wanted to believe Jamal, to believe that everything would be okay. But the memory of Linda's sneering face and the cold eyes of the man in the SUV kept haunting him. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Marcus felt a strange sense of resolve. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them break him. The next few days passed in a blur. The interview aired on the local news, and within hours, it had spread like wildfire. Social media was flooded with reactions, outrage, support, and calls for justice. Marcus's story had struck a chord, and people from all over the country were demanding accountability. But with the attention came new challenges. Reporters camped outside the cabin, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every word. Strangers showed up, some offering support, others spewing hate. The small, quiet refuge that Tom's cabin had been was now anything but peaceful. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. The comments on the news articles were a mix of encouragement and vitriol. Some people praised him for speaking out, while others accused him of lying or exaggerating. He felt like he was being pulled in a million different directions, his emotions swinging between hope and despair. Sarah walked into the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. She had been on the phone almost nonstop, coordinating with lawyers, activists, and journalists. She hung up and sat down across from Marcus, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "We've got a meeting with the district attorney tomorrow," she said. "They want to hear your side of the story and see if there's enough evidence to press charges against Linda." Marcus nodded, though he felt a pang of anxiety. "What if they don't believe me?" he asked. Sarah reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "They will," she said firmly. "We've got the video, witness statements, and the police report. It's a strong case. But you need to be ready to tell your story again. Can you do that?" Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Yeah," he said. "I can do it." Sarah smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "You're stronger than you think, Marcus. Don't ever forget that." The next morning, Marcus, Sarah, and Jamal drove to the district attorney's office in the nearby city. The building was imposing, its tall glass windows reflecting the bright morning sun. Marcus felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach as they walked inside, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him. The meeting was held in a small conference room, the walls lined with bookshelves and legal documents. The district attorney, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, sat at the head of the table. She introduced herself as DA Reynolds and gestured for them to sit. "Thank you for coming in," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "I've reviewed the evidence, but I'd like to hear your account of what happened." Marcus nodded, his throat dry. He glanced at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then at Jamal, who offered a reassuring smile. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He told the story from the beginning. How he had stopped at the diner for a quick meal, how Linda had treated him with disdain, and how she had poured the scalding coffee on his face. He described the pain, the humiliation, and the fear he had felt in that moment. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of the memory pressing down on him, but he kept going, determined to see it through. When he finished, the room was silent. DA Reynolds leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said. "I know that couldn't have been easy." Marcus nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "I just want her to be held accountable," he said. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else." DA Reynolds nodded, her expression serious. "I understand," she said. "And based on the evidence we have, I believe we have a strong case. We'll be pressing charges against Linda for assault and hate crime charges. We'll also be looking into the man who threatened you in the SUV. If we can identify him, we'll bring him in as well." Marcus felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that this was far from over. "Thank you," he said quietly. DA Reynolds stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "We'll be in touch," she said. "In the meantime, stay safe. And if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." As they left the building, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. He was relieved that the district attorney was taking his case seriously, but he also felt a lingering sense of unease. He knew that Linda and her friends weren't going to back down without a fight, and the thought of what they might do next filled him with dread. Sarah seemed to sense his anxiety. "We're not out of the woods yet," she said, her voice low, "but we're making progress, and we're not going to let them intimidate us." Jamal clapped Marcus on the back, his usual bravado returning. "You heard the lady," he said. "We got this." And if anyone tries to mess with us, they'll have to deal with me. Marcus smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He appreciated Jamal's optimism, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a storm. As they drove back to the cabin, Marcus's phone buzzed. He pulled it out and saw a notification from a news app. The headline made his heart skip a beat. Racist waitress released on bail. Supporters rally outside courthouse. He clicked on the article, his stomach churning as he read. Linda had been released on bail, and a group of her supporters had gathered outside the courthouse, waving signs and chanting slogans. The article included a photo of Linda, her face smug as she waved to the crowd. Marcus felt a surge of anger and fear. He had hoped that Linda would be held accountable, that she would face consequences for what she had done. But now, it seemed like she was being celebrated, her actions excused or even praised. Sarah glanced at him, her expression concerned. "What's wrong?" she asked. Marcus handed her the phone, his hands trembling. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she read the article, her jaw tightening. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low. "We're not going to let her win." Jamal leaned over from the back seat, his expression dark. "What do we do now?" he asked. Sarah handed the phone back to Marcus, her expression determined. "We keep fighting," she said. "We've got the truth on our side, and we're not going to back down." Marcus nodded, though he still felt a knot of fear in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them break him. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, replaying the events of the past few days over and over again. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, one that was only getting worse. But as he stared at the ceiling, he felt a strange sense of resolve. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew he wasn't going to face it alone. He had Sarah, Jamal, and Tom on his side, and together they were going to fight back. The next morning, Marcus woke up to the sound of voices outside the cabin. He sat up quickly, his heart racing, and glanced out the window. A small crowd had gathered near the edge of the property, their signs and banners visible even from a distance. Some were supporters, holding signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "End Racism Now." But others were clearly there to oppose him, their signs bearing hateful slogans and messages of support for Linda. Marcus felt a surge of anxiety. He had known that the case would draw attention, but he hadn't expected it to escalate so quickly. He quickly got dressed and went downstairs, where Sarah and Jamal were already in the kitchen, their expressions tense. "What's going on out there?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. Sarah glanced out the window, her jaw tight. "Supporters and protesters," she said. "The media coverage has stirred up a lot of strong feelings. Some people are on your side, but others, not so much." Jamal crossed his arms, his expression dark. "We need to get rid of them," he said. "This is supposed to be a safe place." Sarah shook her head. "We can't just chase them off," she said. "That'll only make things worse. We need to handle this carefully." Marcus felt a knot of fear tighten in his chest. He didn't know what to do. He had never been in a situation like this before, and the thought of facing a crowd, especially one that included people who hated him, was overwhelming. Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. Tom, who had been keeping watch outside, stepped in, his expression grim. "We got a problem," he said. "There's a reporter out there who wants to talk to Marcus. She says she's from a national news network." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Which one?" she asked. Tom shrugged. "I didn't catch the name, but she's persistent. Says she won't leave until she gets an interview." Marcus felt a surge of panic. He didn't want to talk to anyone else, especially not a national reporter. The thought of his story being broadcast to millions of strangers made him feel exposed, vulnerable. Sarah seemed to sense his anxiety. "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with," she said gently. "But this could be an opportunity. If we can get your story out to a wider audience, it'll put more pressure on Linda and her supporters." Marcus hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't know if he could handle another interview, but he also knew that Sarah was right. If they wanted to win this fight, they needed all the support they could get. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Sarah nodded, her expression determined. "We'll handle it together," she said. "You're not alone in this." The interview was set up on the porch. The reporter, a woman in her 40s with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, sitting across from Marcus. Sarah and Jamal stood nearby, their presence a silent reminder that Marcus wasn't alone. The reporter introduced herself as Claire Bennett and explained that she was with a major news network. "We've been following your story," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "And we'd like to give you a chance to share your side of it with our audience." Marcus nodded, his throat dry. He glanced at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then at Jamal, who offered a reassuring smile. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He told the story again, from the beginning, his voice shaking at first, but growing steadier as he went on. He described the humiliation, the pain, and the fear he had felt, and he talked about the support he had received from Sarah, Jamal, and others. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of the memory pressing down on him, but he kept going, determined to see it through. When he finished, the reporter nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said. "I know that couldn't have been easy." Marcus nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "I just want her to be held accountable," he said. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else." The reporter smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "Your courage is inspiring," she said, "and I think your story is going to make a difference." After the interview, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. He was relieved that it was over, but he also felt a lingering sense of unease. He knew that the story was going to be broadcast to millions of people, and the thought of being in the spotlight made him feel exposed, vulnerable. As the reporter and her crew packed up their equipment, Sarah pulled Marcus aside. "You did great," she said, her voice filled with pride. "This is going to make a difference. I can feel it." Marcus nodded, though he still felt a knot of fear in his chest. "I hope so," he said quietly. Jamal joined them, his usual bravado returning. "You're a hero, man," he said, clapping Marcus on the back. "People are going to remember this." Marcus smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired, scared, and overwhelmed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Marcus sat on the porch, staring out at the forest. The crowd outside had dispersed, but he could still feel their presence, like a shadow hanging over him. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them break him. Sarah joined him, sitting down in the chair next to his. "You okay?" she asked gently. Marcus nodded, though he still felt a knot of fear in his chest. "I don't know what's going to happen," he admitted, "but I know I'm not going to face it alone." Sarah smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "You're stronger than you think, Marcus," she said, "and we're going to get through this together." Marcus nodded, though he still felt a lingering sense of unease. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them break him. The national news interview aired that night, and the response was immediate. Marcus's story spread like wildfire, dominating social media and news cycles. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #EndRacism trended nationwide, and people from all walks of life voiced their support. Celebrities, activists, and politicians weighed in, condemning Linda's actions and calling for systemic change. But with the support came backlash. Linda's supporters doubled down, organizing rallies and flooding social media with hateful messages. Marcus's face was everywhere, on TV, in newspapers, on the internet, and he felt like he couldn't escape it. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. One evening, as Marcus sat on the porch, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. His stomach dropped as he read it. "You think you're safe? Think again." He showed the message to Sarah, who immediately called the police. They arrived quickly, taking the threat seriously, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. "We'll increase patrols in the area," one officer said, "but you should consider relocating until things calm down." Marcus felt a surge of frustration. He didn't want to run again, but he also didn't want to put Sarah, Jamal, or Tom in danger. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah's expression was grim. "We need to stay smart," she said. "We've got the law on our side, but we can't take any chances. Let's lay low for a while and let the authorities handle this." Jamal, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "What if we take the fight to them?" he said, his voice low. We got the truth on our side. Let's organize a rally. Show them we're not afraid. Sarah shook her head. It's too risky, she said. We don't know who's behind these threats, and we can't afford to provoke them. Marcus agreed, though he hated the idea of hiding. He felt like he was being forced into a corner with no good options. Maybe we should leave, he said quietly. Just for a little while, until things calmed down. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Okay, she said. But we're not running. We're regrouping, and we're coming back stronger. The next morning, they packed up their things and left the cabin. Tom stayed behind to keep an eye on the property, while Sarah, Marcus, and Jamal drove to a safe house in the city. It was a small apartment, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, and it felt like a world away from the chaos of the past few days. As they settled in, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. He was relieved to be away from the constant threats, but he also felt a lingering sense of guilt. He didn't want to drag Sarah and Jamal into his mess, but he also knew he couldn't do this alone. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. It's the district attorney, she said. She wants to talk to us? Marcus felt a surge of anxiety. What about? He asked. Sarah shook her head. I don't know, she said, but we'll find out tomorrow. The next day, they met with DA Reynolds in her office. Her expression was serious as she greeted them, and Marcus felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. We've made progress in the case, she said, getting straight to the point. We've identified the man in the SUV. His name is Carl Higgins, and he's a known associate of Linda's. We've brought him in for questioning, and he's cooperating. Marcus felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that this was far from over. What about Linda? He asked. DA Reynolds' expression darkened. She's not backing down, she said. In fact, she's trying to turn this into a media circus. She's claiming that she's the victim, that you provoked her, and that the video was edited to make her look bad. Marcus felt a surge of anger. That's not true, he said, his voice trembling. She's lying. DA Reynolds nodded. We know, she said, and we're going to prove it. But we need your help. We need you to testify in court. It's the only way to ensure she's held accountable. Marcus hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't know if he could handle facing Linda again, especially in a courtroom. But he also knew that he didn't have a choice. If he wanted justice, he had to see this through. Okay, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do it. DA Reynolds smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. Thank you, she said. Your courage is going to make a difference. As they left the office, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. He was relieved that the case was moving forward, but he also felt a lingering sense of unease. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them break him. Sarah and Jamal walked beside him, their presence a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. We've got this, Sarah said, her voice firm. No matter what happens, we're going to see this through. Jamal nodded, his expression determined. You're not alone in this, Marcus, he said. We've got your back. Marcus nodded, though he still felt a knot of fear in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them break him. The day of the trial arrived, and Marcus felt like he was walking into a storm. The courthouse was surrounded by media vans and protesters, their voices rising in a cacophony of anger and support. Signs waved in the air, some bearing Marcus's name, others defending Linda. The tension was palpable, and Marcus felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach as he stepped out of the car. Sarah and Jamal flanked him, their presence a steadying force. You've got this, Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. Just tell the truth. That's all you need to do. Marcus nodded, though his hands were trembling. He didn't know if he had the strength to face Linda again, to relive the humiliation and pain in front of a courtroom full of strangers. But he also knew he didn't have a choice. If he wanted justice, he had to see this through. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers. Marcus took his place at the plaintiff's table, his heart pounding as he glanced at the defense table. Linda sat there, her expression smug, her eyes cold. She didn't look at him, but he could feel her presence like a weight pressing down on him. The trial began, and the district attorney laid out the case with precision and care. She presented the video evidence, the witness statements, and the medical reports detailing Marcus's injuries. She painted a clear picture of what had happened, leaving no room for doubt. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, he felt a surge of panic. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and walked to the stand. As he sat down, he glanced at Sarah and Jamal, who gave him encouraging nods. He turned his attention to the district attorney, who began her questioning. "Marcus," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "can you tell us what happened on the day of the incident?" Marcus nodded, his throat dry. He began to speak, his voice shaking at first, but growing steadier as he went on. He described the events of that day in detail, from the moment he walked into the diner to the moment Linda poured the coffee on his face. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of the memory pressing down on him, but he kept going, determined to see it through. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. The district attorney nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "No further questions?" The defense attorney stood, his expression cold as he approached Marcus. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his tone sharp, "isn't it true that you were being rude and disruptive in the diner that day?" Marcus shook his head, his voice firm. "No," he said. "I wasn't." The attorney pressed on, his questions becoming more aggressive. He tried to twist Marcus's words, to make him doubt himself, but Marcus held his ground. He told the truth, no matter how hard the attorney tried to shake him. When the cross-examination was over, Marcus felt a surge of relief. He had done it. He had faced Linda and her attorney, and he hadn't backed down. The trial continued for several days, with witnesses taking the stand and evidence being presented. Sarah testified, recounting what she had seen and heard in the diner. Jamal spoke about the threats they had received and the impact the incident had on Marcus. Even Tom took the stand, describing the events at the cabin and the measures they had taken to stay safe. Finally, it was time for the closing arguments. The district attorney stood, her expression serious as she addressed the jury. "This case is about more than just one man's suffering," she said. "It's about accountability. It's about justice. Linda Higgins committed an act of violence, motivated by hate, and she needs to be held accountable for her actions." The defense attorney stood, his tone dismissive. "This case is about a misunderstanding," he said. "Linda Higgins is a hardworking woman who made a mistake. She's not a criminal, and she doesn't deserve to be punished for one moment of poor judgment." The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Marcus sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched in his lap, his heart pounding. He didn't know what was going to happen, but he knew one thing for certain. He had done everything he could. Finally, the jury returned, their faces unreadable. The judge asked for the verdict, and the foreman stood. "We find the defendant, Linda Higgins, guilty of assault and committing a hate crime." The courtroom erupted in noise, some people cheering, others shouting in anger. Marcus felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't over. Linda was led out of the courtroom, her expression furious, and Marcus knew she wasn't going to let this go. As they left the courthouse, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. He was relieved that Linda had been held accountable, but he also felt a lingering sense of unease. He knew that this wasn't the end, that there would be appeals, protests, and more battles to fight. But for now, he could breathe. Sarah and Jamal walked beside him, their presence a steadying force. "You did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with pride. "You stood up for yourself, and you won." Jamal clapped him on the back, his usual bravado returning. "You're a hero, man," he said. "People are going to remember this." Marcus smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired, scared, and overwhelmed. But he also felt a strange sense of resolve. He had faced his fears, and he had come out stronger. As they drove away from the courthouse, Marcus looked out the window, the city passing by in a blur. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them break him. Marcus's story is a powerful reminder that standing up against hate and injustice is never easy, but it's always worth it. His courage has sparked a movement, but the fight is far from over. Racism, discrimination, and violence still plague our communities, and it's up to all of us to take a stand. If Marcus's story moved you, if it made you angry, if it inspired you, don't stop here. Share this story. Amplify his voice. Educate yourself and others. Support organizations fighting for racial justice. Hold people accountable. And most importantly, speak up when you see injustice happening around you. Change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we come together, when we refuse to back down, and when we demand better. Let's make sure Marcus's bravery isn't just a moment. It's the start of a movement. Like, share, and subscribe to keep this conversation alive. Together, we can create a world where no one has to face what Marcus did. Because justice isn't just a word. It's a fight we all need to be part of. What will you do to make a difference today?